When you think of Cuba, you may think of the colorful, dazzling classic cars that fill the city streets. Today, we'll discuss what these cars are, who maintains them, what they represent, and how they've influenced Latinx culture in Miami. Let's start at the beginning. After the Model T was popularized in the United States, Cuba quickly became the largest Latin American importer of US cars and one of the countries with the most cars per capita in the world. At the time, cars such as four-door Chevy sedans were very popular. The Cuban car market was so big that some US car manufacturers sold cars in Cuba before the US to test run their models. However, from 1959 to the early 2000s, relations between Cuba and the US were so bad that it became virtually impossible to find parts to maintain the thousands of vintage cars in Cuba, let alone to purchase new American cars. Why was this relationship so bad? Let's dive deeper into this conflict. In the first half of the 20th century, the relationship between the US and Cuba was fairly amicable. The US sold cars to Cubans, and Americans bought Cuban sugar. In 1959, Fidel Castro came into power after the Cuban Revolution and quickly nationalized all foreign assets in Cuba without compensation. He also banned most US and other foreign imports, stopping the car industry in its tracks, and began trade deals with the USSR. In response, US President Eisenhower slashed Cuban imports, imposing an extensive trade embargo. Castro continued imposing more strict restrictions on Cuban citizens, such as restricting private ownership of cars and building the economy in a way that limited the average Cuban citizen's income to around $20 a month. Although most jobs make a similarly small salary, taxi drivers are actually one of the only careers with a less restricted income. Most drivers charge $20 to $40 an hour, making much more money in an hour than even Cuban doctors and businessmen make in a month. So, knowing the economic benefits of owning a car in Cuba, combined with the hardships that come with maintaining that car, let's examine the value and importance of classic cars in Cuban culture. First of all, ownership and pride. Being a communist country, ownership of many things in Cuba was and still is restricted. Although it was difficult to purchase new cars after the revolution, cars that were purchased before the Cuban Revolution were allowed to stay in the hands of their owners. After the revolution, many Cuban citizens fled to the US or other countries, leaving their cars to family members or friends who stayed behind. Owning a car became a symbol of individualism and a point of pride for those that drove them. They were also a reminder of the pre-revolution middle-class lifestyle. After many years, the same cars still occupy the roads, but their value has grown from being simply a symbol of status to additionally being a sign of resourcefulness, ingenuity, personality, and pride. Let's focus on resourcefulness and ingenuity for a moment. One of the most interesting things about many of the cars driving around Cuba today is that many of their parts are not original to the car, the model, or even to the brand. Some parts in use did not, in fact, even come from cars. This engine uses hospital IV tubes as fuel lines. As a result of trade deals with the USSR, some Soviet cars were imported during the mid to late 1900s, but they were much less durable than the older American cars, so many of them were eventually scrapped for parts that were then used to repair the old American cars. In addition to simply maintaining old cars, innovative mechanics also combine cars together to change the appearance, usefulness, and efficiency of that car. In some places, you may find these Frankensteiners, cars that have been converted from a sedan to a much longer vehicle that seats more people. Many cars that have been fitted with custom handmade parts are often painted with vibrant colors to cover up the mismatched surfaces, materials, or pieces that make up the car. Lastly, we have the importance of tourism and income. As I mentioned earlier, the average Cuban citizen's income is around $20 a month. Driving a taxi is one of the only jobs available to the average citizen that has a virtually unlimited salary. Taxi drivers often charge as much as $45 an hour for scenic rides around Cuban cities. These taxis are often the more pristine and original classic cars, whereas the taxis used by locals range anywhere from perfectly kept 1950s Chevys to 1970s Soviet sedans to Frankensteiners. However, we haven't touched much on the colorful vibrancy that classic cars contribute to everyday city scenes in Cuba, but the striking color and vintage aesthetic attract many tourists to Havana and other cities every year. With increased revenue from tourism, car owners can spend more on maintenance, which then makes the cars on Cuba's streets even more interesting and striking. So, we now see the importance of classic cars in Cuban culture, but how has this phenomenon impacted Latinx culture in the United States? 100 short miles from Cuba's coast is the coast of Florida, USA. In Miami alone, there are over 1.2 million Cuban American residents. Despite the generations of car appreciation in Cuba, the cars you may find in Miami are drastically different. Cars in Miami combine LA Chicano lowrider culture with the post 1959 Cuban love of cars. Typical lowriders in California are vibrantly painted with religious iconography and intricate designs like the ones you see here. But Cuban Americans and Miami have redefined the lowrider aesthetic by tying in the values of Cuban car owners. Miami lowriders feature low-key, sleek aesthetics with intense color coordination and original parts. This, in the context of car culture in Cuba, makes perfect sense. Most Cuban car owners are unable to purchase original parts, so this new access to custom, professionally made parts drives the aesthetics of these Miami cars. Instead of the flashy, hand-painted colors typical to LA lowriders and Cuban classic cars, Miami lowriders instead opt for more subdued, detail-oriented decor. In this sense, the culture of classic car maintenance in Cuba has transferred to Latinx culture in the US and Miami specifically, but in the broader, more ideological sense. Cuban car culture and Miami lowrider culture are actually inherently similar, as they are based around the pride that comes from ownership and the care and attention behind constant maintenance. To conclude, Cuban classic car culture appears on the surface to be the aesthetic appreciation of vintage cars, but it is rooted in ingenuity, pride, entrepreneurship, and individualism. Since 1959, Cuban citizens and Cuban Americans have used cars as ways to express themselves and establish themselves no matter the circumstances. Above all, these are beautiful cars, but they are much, much more than that.